there, apples, and welcome to a new episode of the Apple Orchard. It's been a while, so yeah, if you missed us, we missed you. So today we have a new segment for this podcast, and it's called Is It Right? Now, this segment will be discussing and unpacking different real life ethical dilemmas and ask the big question: is it morally right or wrong? So without further ado, let's start. First and foremost, I'm your host for today, Chelsea. Yeah, hi guys. So today, we will, as I mentioned earlier, we will be tackling different cases, well, two cases to be exact, we will be discussing two cases, and we will analyze each case, whether it's morally right or wrong, based on different ethical perspectives discussed in philosophy. So now let's have our first case, but I'll let Bianca explain this case first.
So for our first case, we have a 36-year-old accountant who is a normal person with a wife, a family. He has children until one day he's diagnosed with a fatal malignant tumor of the lymph nodes. He's admitted to the hospital, but his condition is slowly worsening. His family has been paying the hospital lots of money. It's a financially difficult situation. Not to mention that he is in excruciating pain because he has to take addictive doses of narcotics. And the expenses of his treatment thus makes his family more emotionally cold and unavailable to him due to this overall stress situation. The situation seems to be hopeless, and so Charles Johnson asked the doctor to end his life in order to spare his family from more pain. Now the question of this is whether it is morally permissible for the physician to agree to this request or not.
That was a really good explanation, Bianca. So there you have it. That's our first case. And now we will be moving forward to a sub-segment of Is It Right, wherein we will be analyzing this case from a utilitarian perspective. Now let's call the sub-segment, calcu-great or calcu-bad. So yeah, I'll have Bianca explain it once again.
So let's evaluate this according to the standards of utilitarianism, more specifically Bentham's calculus of felicity. So the first one is on intensity. So intensity is the first criteria, and on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the lowest and 10 being the highest, we will rate this on how much pleasure this action will then give the actor, Charles Johnson, right? And we'll rate this a 10 because the pleasure of ending his addictive tendencies towards his narcotic medicines and his excruciating everyday pain due to his condition means that there's an increase in this value because the current sensation of pain is ended, right? So there's a maximum pleasure that is achieved. The second is a duration. We'll also rate this very high, like an 8, because the experience of pleasure in this context will, the pain that he's experiencing right now will last the duration or the remainder of his life, and it would continue until he dies naturally. So we rate this high because at least his pain has ended now. The duration of his pain has been shortened. Next is uncertainty. So we'll rate this a 10 because there's a 100% certainty that this act of ending his life will 100% make all his problems and pains disappear and go away. Next is the propinquity, which is the temporal distance of this basically is 0 because the relief produced by this act is essentially going to be immediate already. So this is going to be a 10 as well. Next, for fecundity, this is that there is a stronger chance this act will be followed by sensations of the same kind, like peace and financial stability, better ways for the family to cope rather than seeing their father in this agonizing state for a long time, rather than risk more financial instability, more trauma. So we'll rate this a 6. So next, for purity, we will rate this low, like a 3, because the high probability that the experience of pleasure will be followed by a sensation of the opposite kind, like pain, is going to be very low. And lastly, we have extent, which is let's rate this a 9 because the value is this includes not just Charles but also his family. His family will definitely be better off. His wife, his children, those who know him will be able to preserve a better image of Charles Johnson than otherwise if he continued to prolong his pain and to continue to quote unquote fight against this tumor. This then means that he will just be further weakened. This will cause far more damages to the people who have to see him like this, who will obviously still visit him in the hospital and who will try their best to support him emotionally. The extent is much better on our side of the house, so we'll give this a 9. So in summary, according to the concept of utilitarianism, we agree that this is a morally right thing to do or a morally ethical thing to do because the weighing metrics that we use have agreed that it is better, or the physician, if I were to be the physician, I would actually agree to this demand simply because it is, according to the principle of utilitarianism, far better. So yes.
So that was very well said by Bianca. So give her a round of applause. So now let's discuss this through a deontological perspective, specifically through Immanuel Kant's eyes. So now this new segment or sub-segment is called Can't You Decide? Kantian ethics is all about duty and moral rules, diba? It's not about feelings or outcomes. It's about whether something is right, period. And Kant gives us 3 principles called the categorical imperative. So the first rule is the principle of universal law. Basically, it technically says that act only according to maxims that can be willed as universal law. Well, in simpler terms, can everyone do this without it being a problem? In this case, the maxim that we have here is whenever a patient is suffering excruciating pain from an illness, a doctor may help a patient end their life to relieve suffering. So now, it sounds compassionate, diba? But if that became a universal law, doctors wouldn't just save lives, they'd also end them. That kind of messes up with trust. Like, are they here to heal you or not? furthermore, when you think about it, they would also be disrespecting the sanctity of life that that person has. Which leads us to the next principle, which is the principle, wait, ano tawag dun? Ano tawag dun? Principle of respect for person or principle of ends. So ngayon, this says that people should never be treated as a means to an end, or basically, we should not treat people as objects, but as humans themselves. We mustn't use them as tools, but we must treat them as if, as a person, who they are. Now, this principle mostly focuses on human dignity, like the inherent value humans have. So in this case, Charles wants to die partly so that he is not a burden anymore. That means he is treating his own life like a solution to a problem. And if the doctor helps him, same thing. They are treating his life as disposable, which is not valuing life or acknowledging the inherent worth a human has, because it violates one's human dignity. So Kant says nope. Human life has no value, no matter what. Human life has value, no matter what. And last is the kingdom of ends, or principle of autonomy. Now, this principle promotes that everyone is a maker of universal law. So imagine a world where everyone follows moral rules that respect people. Now, do you think we would really agree to a rule that says ending lives is okay just to avoid suffering? Hell nah. Kant would say absolutely not in my watchdog. So in the end, if it's sad and although it's sad and complicated, Kantian ethics says that the doctor should not help. Because for Kant, doing the right thing is not about feelings or emotions. It is sticking to moral law and living morally right, regardless of consequences and emotions. So, all in all, what's Kant's verdict? Has Kant decided? Well, Kant says nope. Kant says absolutely not, in his point of view. So, there you have it. That's the Kantian perspective. Moving on, let's have Mahi discuss virtue ethics, or this, in an Aristotelian perspective. So, this new sub-segment is called Aristotle and the Three Bears.
So, from an Aristotelian perspective, the situation isn't just whether about something being right or wrong in a simple way, but it's about whether the action involved reflects a moral virtue and leads to a good and meaningful life. Aristotle mostly focuses on the idea of the golden mean, where virtue lies between two extremes or vices. In Charles Johnson's case, the suffering is extreme. He is in constant pain, he's emotionally isolated, and worried about his family's future. His request to end his life could be seen as something coming from a place of despair, which Aristotle would consider a vice related to the lack of courage. Courage as a virtue lies between cowardice and recklessness. Ending one's life to escape pain might be viewed as leaning towards cowardice because it avoids enduring hardships. However, it is also not entirely reckless because his reasoning is not impulsive, but rather he's thinking about his family and their well-being. At the same time, we also have to consider compassion, especially from the physician's perspective. A doctor helping him might be seen as acting out of compassion, trying to relieve suffering. But Aristotle would also bring the virtue of justice, which involves respecting life and fulfilling one's role properly. A physician's role is to heal and preserve life, so assisting in ending a life could be seen as going against a role, which would make it a deviation from virtue. There's also the idea of temperance or self-control. Charles is dealing with intense physical and emotional pain, and while his desire to escape is understandable, Aristotle might argue that this virtue involves enduring suffering in a balanced and rational way, rather than choosing an extreme situation, like ending one's life. Overall, from an Aristotelian perspective, it would likely not be considered morally permissible for the physician to agree to his request. This is because the action leans towards vices like despair and the failure to fully uphold virtues like courage, justice, and temperance. Instead, Aristotle would emphasize responding to the situation in a way that maintains moral character, such as providing care, support, and pain management, while still respecting the natural course of life. So, while Charles' situation is deeply tragic and his reasoning is understandable, Aristotle would ultimately focus on whether the action aligns with virtue, and in this case, assisting in ending the life would not fully reflect the moral virtues needed for a good and ethical life.
So after analyzing this case through different perspectives, we arise to the question of which among the ethical theories do you think best addresses the problem in the particular case. So I'll answer it for this one. Well, after analyzing, there's no clear answer that it's clearly that each theory gives different answers, but there are some that are more helpful than others. So I believe that utilitarianism fits the best to me. It's all about, the outcomes of, or the consequence of this action, how much it would affect people there. So the outcomes would be like reducing suffering and maximizing happiness. Helping Charles, could stop his excruciating pain and ease the emotional and financial burden on his family. From a practical perspective, it directly addresses the real-world consequences of this situation. So if I had to pick, I'd say that utilitarianism fits best because it focuses more on reducing harm and increasing well-being of everyone involved, which is exactly what Charles and his family needs. That doesn't mean that you ignore dignity or compassion. It just means the moral focus is on the real impact of your actions, which the other ethical theories often ignore and don't really suggest well. So now, how would I address this problem? Honestly, I would address this case with a human-centered approach or perspective, which means that I would want to respect a person's autonomy or decisions. They know themselves more, they know what they feel, and they know their life situation. So I would allow them to have a voice and have a choice on what they decide on doing. In fact, I would also in situations like this for other cases, I think we should also prioritize compassionate care or palliative care and pain management that can, slightly relieve the pain and suffering that those who are terminally ill would feel. And also, it's best to support their families emotionally and practically, since they're also part of the impact too. So yeah, in the end, my approach isn't really about following the rules or maximizing happiness or being a perfectly virtuous person. It's about making the end of life as humane, dignified, and pain-free as possible while respecting everyone involved. It's all about feeling compassionate and understanding that people arise to those decisions because of what they feel, and it's important to understand people's decisions and feeling compassionate about their situation as well. So that's how I think I would handle a situation like this. So there you have it for case 1. Now let's discuss our next case, which we'll call the eye test. So let me read the case aloud to you all. Cosmetics manufacturers often test products, such as shampoos, by dropping them in the eyes of rabbits. At Cosmetech, this practice often results in the rabbits going blind. The practice also causes considerable pain to the rabbits. When the rabbits go blind or are otherwise no longer suitable for tests, they are killed in a painless way. Recently, animal rights activists have begun protesting this practice at Cosmetech and similar firms, blockading the entrance to the plant and advocating that customers no longer buy the products. Industry advocates argue that this method of testing products is common and that testing of animals has prevented releasing some serious harmful chemicals or products to the public. Better blind animals than humans. Who has the moral high ground in this argument? So let's go back again to what's the utilitarianism segment again? Loki forgot, but anyway, here's Mahi again to discuss it.
From a utilitarian perspective, the main question is which action produces the greatest overall happiness and the least amount of suffering. Instead of focusing on rules, we look at the consequences, and we apply the philosophic calculus, which measures pleasure and pain using factors like intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. In this case, cosmetic testing on rabbits causes extreme suffering, including pain, blindness, and eventually death. If we apply the philosophic calculus to the animals, we get very high values. Intensity is a 10, duration is a 8, certainty is a 10, propinquity is a 10, fecundity is a 8, purity is a 3, and extent is 9, giving us a total of 56. This shows that the suffering is not only severe, but also long-lasting, unavoidable, and affects a large number of animals. On the other hand, the benefits to human is product safety. While this is important, we also have to consider how necessary that benefit is. Since these are mainly cosmetic products and not essential for survival, the level of benefit is more moderate compared to the extreme suffering experienced by these animals. In addition, the certainty that animal testing is the only way to ensure safety is decreasing, especially with other modern alternatives like lab-based testing methods. When we compare both sides, the total suffering of animals clearly outweighs the benefits gained by humans. A utilitarian approach aims to minimize overall harm, and in this situation, continuing animal testing creates more suffering than happiness. Because of this, a utilitarian would argue that the animal rights activists have the moral high ground, since they're trying to reduce overall suffering and push for alternatives. Overall, from a utilitarian perspective, animal testing in this case is not morally justified because it results in more harm than good.
Well, let's move forward and let's discuss this again through Kantian lens. But this time it's not me. I'll be handing the floor over to Cody to discuss the Kantian perspective.
So medyo controversial si Kant in terms of issues surrounding animals kasi when you look at the categorical imperative, there's no direct reference to these issues surrounding animals. They more pertain to rational beings, or more accurately, the rational agency of the people involved. Pero luckily, in-address niya rin to sa book niya na The Metaphysics of Morals na pinablished noong 1797, wherein he states, the shared feeling of their suffering and so weakens and gradually uproots a natural predisposition that is very serviceable to morality in one's relations with other human beings. So what this means is, it's an example of an indirect duty. We have to not look at whether it's an animal or a person or the environment, but it's this principle that there's a lack of empathy. And when you relate it to the first formulation, if you were to universalize this, then that would mean any being being experimented on is okay if it benefits people. And there's a contradiction there kasi with any being you can say na people being experimented on is okay because it benefits people. And in a related manner, another problem arises when you connect this to the second formulation. Kasi if you're experimenting on other people, it means that you're using people as a means to an end, or you're using people as a tool to get to do an experiment, and this ignores the intrinsic dignity that people have according to the second formulation.
Last but not the least is once again Aristotle and the Three Bears. So let's have Chiana take the floor and discuss this all through the eyes of Aristotle and his virtue ethics.
So for the virtue ethics perspective, I think this case really shifts the focus from just rules or consequences to what kind of people we are becoming through our actions. If we look at it through Aristotelian virtue ethics, the main question isn't just, does this produce good results, or is this morally allowed, but rather, does this action reflect good character, and are the people involved acting with virtues like compassion, temperance, and justice? In this case, cosmetic companies are testing products on rabbits in ways that cause blindness and pain. Even if they argue that it helps prevent harm to humans, virtue ethics would ask, what kind of character is shown by knowingly causing suffering to vulnerable animals? That doesn't really align with virtues like compassion or kindness. Instead, it suggests cruelty or at least a lack of moral sensitivity. A virtuous person, according to Aristotle, aims for the golden mean, a balance. But here it seems excessive. The harm inflicted on animals for something non-essential like cosmetics feels morally disproportionate. It's not like testing life-saving medicine where the stakes are much higher. Also, if we think about justice, virtue ethics isn't just about fairness between humans. It can extend to how we treat living beings in general. Causing unnecessary suffering, especially when alternatives may exist, reflects a failure in moral character. Now, on the other hand, the activists protesting the practice could be seen as embodying virtues like courage and compassion, since they're standing up for those who can't defend themselves. But even then, virtue ethics would still ask if their methods like blocking entrances are done in a balanced and reasonable way, or if they go too far. So overall, from an Aristotelian perspective, I'd say the moral high ground leans more toward the animal rights activists, because their stance aligns more with virtues like compassion and justice. Meanwhile, the company's actions reflect a kind of moral insensitivity, prioritizing profit or convenience over ethical character. And I think that's the key takeaway here. Virtue ethics remind us that morality isn't just about outcomes or rules, but about becoming people who naturally choose to do what's kind, fair, and humane.
After analyzing this case through the different perspectives, we arise to the question once more, which ethical theory works best for this case? And if I had to pick, it would be virtue ethics because it emphasizes practical compassion. It pushes us to care for other living beings in our planet and avoid their unnecessary suffering and act with moral character in real-world situations. It helps us analyze this situation in a way being a virtuous person is someone who not only cares for human beings or like fellow human beings, but as well as other living creatures and other beings in our world. Unlike, strict rules or cold calculations, it asks us and it helps us think, what kind of person should I be? Should I be a person who, doesn't care for animals at all, or should I be a person who wants the well-being and welfare of every living being in this planet? Now, beyond the theories, I'd approach this problem by combining empathy, innovation, and ethical responsibility. I would advocate for animal testing methods like lab-grown tissues or computer simulations or any other technological advancement that would be a better alternative, a better and more safer and virtuous alternative compared to animal testing. I would also push for stricter regulations and transparency with the companies that still continue animal testing, that every company must be held accountable and it must be known to everybody if they do conduct animal testing. That way, humans are protected without causing extreme suffering to animals. Everyone would live in mutual harmony. The focus of this shifts from just following rules or outcomes to doing what's human, sustainable, and morally courageous, not just for humans, but also for other beings in the earth. Wow, okay. This is a really productive podcast, so I hope we all learned something and realized what things are morally right and morally wrong based on different perspectives. Note that these perspectives can help us all in deciding our actions, and it teaches us to think before something is good or not, or if it's right or wrong. And all in all, this session helped us realize that there are so many ways we can evaluate our actions before we actually do them, and it helps us to think before we act. So, to conclude, this has been Is It Right? And I hope you all enjoyed watching this podcast or listening to it. And that's it for today. And see you again on another episode of The Apple Orchard or any of our new special segments. So, bye apples!